The stars had always called to humanity, and finally they answered back, but the response was not what anyone expected when the first alien message arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in Geneva, where the United Earth Space Command had set up their primary listening post after decades of sending signals into the void, hoping someone would hear them and respond with friendship or at least acknowledgement that humans were not alone in the vast universe that seemed so empty and quiet until that moment. Jake Morrison had been awake for 20 hours straight when the signal came through, his eyes red from staring at monitors that usually showed nothing but cosmic background noise and the occasional burst from a distant star. But this was different because the pattern repeated every 47 seconds with mathematical precision that could only mean intelligence behind it. And he nearly dropped his coffee when he realized what he was seeing on the screen before him. Maria Santos rushed into the communications room when Jake hit the alert button, her dark hair still wet from the shower she had just taken after her shift ended an hour ago. But sleep would have to wait because this was the moment humanity had dreamed about, since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was out there, looking back at them. The message took 6 hours to decode, with the help of every linguist and mathematician that Earth could bring to Geneva, and when the translation finally came through, the excitement in the room died like someone had opened an airlock and sucked all the oxygen into space, because the message was not a greeting from friends but an order from beings who clearly thought they were in charge of everything, including Earth and every human on it. Ben Carter read the translated message 3 times before he believed what he was seeing, his weathered face growing harder with each word as he stood in the command center, surrounded by diplomats and scientists who all looked as shocked as he felt. The message said that humanity had been detected transmitting faster than light communications without authorization from something called the Galactic Council, that Earth was ordered to cease all such activities immediately, and that a probationary period of 500 years would begin, during which humanity must remain in their home system and develop under council observation until deemed ready for contact with other species. Lisa Harper stood beside her, captain, and watched his jaw tighten as he processed the ultimatum, and she knew him well enough after 8 years serving together to recognize the anger building behind his calm exterior, because Ben Carter had not spent his entire career fighting for humanity's place in space, only to be told by aliens that humans had to sit in the corner like children for 5 centuries. The response was drafted carefully over the next 3 days with input from every government on Earth, and though there were arguments about how strongly to word it, everyone agreed that humanity would not accept terms they had no voice in creating, especially from beings who had never bothered to introduce themselves properly before issuing commands, like humans were servants instead of equals. When the Defiant transmitted Earth's response into space, Jake Morrison was back at his station monitoring the communications array, and he felt a strange mix of pride and fear as the message went out, telling the Galactic Council that humanity appreciated the contact but respectfully declined their probationary period and requested proper diplomatic negotiations instead of unilateral demands. The silence that followed lasted 43 days, and during that time Earth's military forces quietly prepared for the possibility that the Council might not appreciate being told no by a species they clearly considered primitive and backward compared to their ancient civilization of 47 member species who had maintained peace and order in the galaxy for 12,000 years according to the limited information they had shared. Maria Santos worked with the analysis team trying to learn everything possible from the Council's transmissions, studying their language structure and cultural references, and what she found troubled her because every phrase they used suggested a rigid hierarchy where older species guided younger ones, and deviation from established protocols was apparently unthinkable to them. When the Council's second message arrived, it was even shorter than the first and contained only a date and time, which after translation turned out to be exactly 90 days from the moment Earth had refused their terms, and attached to this message was a data packet that showed 12 large objects entering the solar system at speeds that should have been impossible according to human physics. Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched the tracking data as those 12 ships moved steadily inward from the outer system, and he knew without being told that this was the Council's answer to humanity's defiance, because apparently when you told these aliens no, they sent a fleet to make you reconsider your position. The defense preparations intensified as every available ship and station went to high alert. And though Earth's fleet was small and primitive compared to what was coming toward them, nobody seriously suggested surrendering without at least making the Council work for their victory, if it came to that. Lisa Harper coordinated with the ground forces while Ben handled the space assets, and together, they built a defense plan that was probably hopeless against such advanced technology, but at least gave humanity a chance to show these Council species that humans did not give up easily when their freedom was threatened. Jake Morrison listened to the Council's broadcasts as their fleet approached, and he noticed something interesting in their communications with each other, because they seemed genuinely confused that humanity had refused their terms and were discussing among themselves how to proceed with a situation that apparently had no precedent in their long history. The linguistic analysis suggested that the Council had encountered hundreds of species over thousands of years, and every single one had accepted their guidance and probationary periods without question. So humanity's refusal had created a problem they did not have procedures for handling. Helen Wright joined the command staff in the final week before the Council fleet arrived, and as Earth's leading expert on alien psychology, she spent hours reviewing everything known about Council culture and behavior, looking for some insight that might help humanity survive what was coming. What she found was both encouraging and terrifying, because the Council appeared to wage war like they did everything else, with strict rules and protocols designed to minimize damage and preserve resources, which meant they probably would not try to exterminate humanity, but also meant they expected Earth to follow those same rules in any conflict. The problem was that humanity had no intention of following rules written by beings who thought 500 years of isolation was a reasonable demand, and Helen suspected that when the Council discovered how humans actually fought when their survival was at stake, the entire galaxy was going to learn something new about warfare that they had apparently forgotten over 12,000 years of civilized peace. Ben Carter gave the order to arm every weapon and prepare every ship when the Council fleet reached Mars orbit and stopped there, holding position like they were waiting for Earth to make the first move, or perhaps give them one last chance to surrender before the real fighting began. The Council fleet hung in space like massive monuments to a civilization that had conquered the stars long before humans learned to make fire, and aboard the flagship Admiral Cortex reviewed his battle plans with the confidence of a being whose species had not lost a military engagement in over 3,000 years, because victory against primitives was not a question but simply a matter of demonstrating superior force until they accepted the inevitable. Frank Peterson watched those alien ships from the bridge of the Sentinel, humanity's largest defense station, and he did not feel the fear that the Council probably expected because he had spent 40 years in Earth's military learning that size and technology mattered less than people thought when the shooting actually started, and desperation made soldiers creative in ways that peacetime planning never anticipated. The war room beneath the Sentinel filled with officers from every branch and nation, and though they had trained together for years preparing for threats from space, none of them had imagined facing an enemy this advanced or this certain of their own superiority, which might turn out to be the Council's biggest weakness if humanity could exploit it properly. Helen Wright sat quietly in the corner and listened to the generals and admirals debate tactics, and she waited until they had exhausted the obvious options before speaking up in the calm voice that always made people listen, even when she said things they did not want to hear. "The Council thinks they know how this ends," she told them, "because they have done this 47 times before with other species, and every time the pattern was the same, where the primitives saw the fleet and surrendered or fought briefly and then surrendered. But humans were not like those other species in ways the Council had not bothered to investigate." Paul Mitchell asked what she meant by that, his scarred hands clasped on the table in front of him, and Helen explained that the Council fought wars like gentlemen playing chess, where both sides agreed on rules, and the goal was winning with minimal damage rather than destroying the opponent. But humanity had spent thousands of years fighting total wars where the only rule was survival and everything else was negotiable, including honor and fairness, and the lives of your own soldiers, if that was what victory required. Amy Rodriguez leaned forward and asked if Helen was suggesting they throw out the accepted rules of warfare. And Helen smiled without humor and said no, because humanity never accepted those rules in the first place, since nobody asked them what rules they wanted to fight by. The plan they developed over the next 18 hours was not pretty or honorable, and it involved tactics that would make the Council think humans were insane or barbaric or both. But as Frank Peterson pointed out, the Council had brought a fleet to force humanity into submission, so maybe they deserved to learn what happened when you backed humans into a corner and gave them no choice but to fight. Peter Grant volunteered to lead the first strike team before anyone finished explaining how dangerous the mission would be. And at 26, he was young for such responsibility. But he had trained for special operations since he was 18, and everyone in the room knew he was good enough to pull off something this crazy if anyone could. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution, because instead of meeting the Council fleet in open battle where their superior technology would dominate, humanity would send small teams and modified mining drones that were too small and too crude for the Council's advanced sensors to identify as threats until it was too late. Jake Morrison coordinated the launch sequence from the Defiant, his hand steady on the controls as he guided 30 drones out of the launch bay, disguised among the debris and wreckage that Earth had deliberately scattered in orbit to create cover, and he watched his screens as those tiny craft drifted toward the Council fleet like space junk caught in gravitational currents. The Council ships ignored them completely, just as the analysts predicted, because beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel and energy shields apparently did not worry about small objects floating nearby, especially objects that registered as unpowered and inert on their scanning systems. Nina Foster checked her equipment one last time as the drone she rode in approached the nearest Council destroyer, and she felt the familiar calm that always came over her before combat. The quiet acceptance that she might die in the next few hours, but at least she would die doing something that mattered. The breaching charge attached to the Council ship's hull with a magnetic clamp, and Nina counted down from 10 before triggering the explosive that tore a hole through armor that was designed to withstand energy weapons, but apparently not. Primitive chemical explosives placed directly against the metal. Atmosphere rushed out of the breach for 3 seconds before automated systems sealed the interior compartments, and Nina's team flooded through the gap into corridors that were wide and well-lit and completely empty of any security forces or defensive positions. Peter Grant could not believe what he was seeing as his team moved deeper into the Council ship, because there were no guards, no weapons emplacements, no bulkheads or checkpoints, nothing to stop intruders who got inside, and he realized that these beings had never considered the possibility that anyone would board their vessels, because their shields and armor were supposed to prevent that. The team spread through 3 different Council ships simultaneously, and everywhere they found the same thing, which was advanced technology operated by crews who had no idea how to fight inside their own vessels and who retreated in confusion when armed humans came through corridors firing weapons. Nina Foster reached the reactor core of her target ship in 18 minutes, and she placed the human-designed explosive device against the containment field generator while Council crew members watched from behind a sealed door and did nothing to stop her, because they apparently had no protocols for this situation. When the timer hit 0 and the reactor containment failed, the Council destroyer came apart from the inside in an explosion that lit up space like a new star being born. And aboard the flagship, Admiral Cortex felt something his species called dread as he watched one of his ships die in a way that should not have been possible. Sarah Blake coordinated the second phase from Earth's military command center, and when she gave the order, every ship and station that humanity had launched everything that could move, not just military vessels but mining haulers and cargo transports and civilian craft that had been hastily fitted with kinetic weapons and sent up to fight. The Council fleet found itself surrounded by hundreds of targets that moved erratically and attacked from every angle with no coordination or discipline, and their advanced tactical computers struggled to predict movements that followed no logical pattern because desperation and creativity were not variables that could be programmed into algorithms designed for civilized warfare. Cortex transmitted to the Council headquarters that the humans were fighting with tactics that violated every principle of engagement, that they sacrificed their own vessels without hesitation, that they attacked like animals instead of sentient beings, and the response from the Council was to adapt defensive postures and eliminate hostiles, which was advice that meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight the way you expected. A mining ship, loaded with ore, slammed into a council cruiser at full thrust and tore through the shields that were designed to deflect energy, weapons but not kinetic impacts from objects that massed thousands of tons, and the cruiser tumbled out of formation, leaking atmosphere and debris, while human fighters swarmed around it like insects tearing apart something much larger than themselves. 6 weeks into the war that was not supposed to be a war, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 400 years, and the chamber that had seen 12,000 years of peaceful debate now, filled with voices raised in alarm and confusion as representatives from 47 species tried to understand how primitives from a backward world had destroyed or captured 8 of their 12 enforcement vessels. Ambassador Velthar stood before the assembled council with his crystalline form dimmed to almost gray, which in his species indicated shame or failure, and he delivered his report in a voice that trembled with emotions that the Arxian collective rarely showed to outsiders. The humans employ tactics we classified as impossible. He said they sacrifice resources we deemed irreplaceable, they fight without regard for accepted conventions, and they show no signs of surrender despite losses that should have broken their will to resist. Elder Sorthana of the Eldari Communion listened to the report with eyes that had witnessed 8 centuries of council history. And when Velthar finished speaking, she raised one ancient hand for silence and said what many were thinking, but none wanted to admit. What you describe is not impossible tactics, she told them. It is total war, the kind of warfare our ancestors practiced before the council brought order to the galaxy. The kind of fighting we thought had been left behind when civilization replaced barbarism. The chamber fell silent as her words sank in, because total war was something the council species knew only from history files. Stories of the dark times when species fought for survival instead of resources, and genocide was a common outcome of conflicts that had no rules to limit the violence. On Earth, Helen Wright met with Jake Morrison in a secure briefing room beneath Geneva, and she spread out psychological profiles of captured council crew members across the table between them, while he studied the data with growing understanding. They are terrified, Helen said. Not just of our tactics, but of what we represent, because one of the Arxian officers kept repeating that humans fight like the old ones, which is what they call the species that existed before the council formed. Jake asked what happened to these old ones, and Helen's expression turned grim as she explained that they destroyed each other in wars so terrible that the survivors banded together and created the council specifically to prevent such conflicts from ever happening again. The council has spent 12,000 years building a civilization where war is managed and controlled and limited. She continued, where combat is almost ritualized and the goal is always to preserve rather than destroy. And then we appeared and showed them what war looks like when the stakes are extinction instead of politics. The military situation had shifted in ways that confused both sides, because humanity had lost thousands of soldiers and dozens of vessels, but kept fighting with the same intensity, while the council had lost far fewer personnel, but their remaining ships were paralyzed by uncertainty about how to proceed against an enemy that did not behave according to any known patterns. Lisa Harper had been promoted to captain after the previous commander of her vessel died in a boarding action, and now she stood on the bridge planning an operation that was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on whether the council had learned anything from the past 6 weeks. Her target was the council flagship itself, the massive vessel where Admiral Corthex commanded what remained of the enforcement fleet, and her plan involved using a captured council ship to get close enough to board before they realized what was happening. The captured vessel had been taken mostly intact when its crew abandoned ship rather than face human boarders in close combat, and Earth's engineers had spent 3 weeks learning to operate the alien systems with help from 2 council technicians who had chosen to cooperate rather than be imprisoned. Maria Santos served as the pilot because she had the best feel for the strange controls, and she guided the ship toward the flagship while transmitting council identification codes that should prevent them from being fired upon. The deception worked better than anyone expected, and the flagship's docking bay accepted them without question, because the idea that humans might capture a council vessel and use it for infiltration was apparently beyond their tactical planning. Lisa led her team of 20 into the flagship's corridors, and they moved quickly through passages that were wider and more elaborate than the destroyer they had practiced in. The flagship's Crew reacted with shock when armed humans appeared in sections that should have been secure, and they retreated according to their training, which emphasized preservation of life over defending positions. Lisa's team reached the command center in 40 minutes, moving through a ship that was designed for efficiency rather than security, and they found Admiral Korthek standing alone in the center of a circular bridge surrounded by holographic displays. The Vanith Admiral was tall and covered in scales that shifted between blue and purple, and he made no move to resist when Lisa's soldiers surrounded him with weapons drawn. "I have been expecting something like this," Korthek said in perfectly clear English that surprised everyone, "because your species does not fight according to patterns that allow prediction." Lisa lowered her weapon slightly and asked why he had not increased security, if he expected an attack. And the Admiral's scales shifted to a color that the translator interpreted as resignation. "Because we have no training for internal combat," he explained. "No protocols for defending our ships from within. No weapons designed for use in our own corridors. Because in 12,000 years of Council history, no species has ever boarded an enemy vessel during combat." The conversation that followed was not what Lisa had planned, because instead of taking the Admiral prisoner or sabotaging the flagship, she found herself in a discussion about why the Council and humanity were fighting at all. Korthek explained that the probationary period was standard procedure, designed to help primitive species develop safely, that it had been used successfully 47 times, and that the Council genuinely believed they were helping humanity by preventing them from expanding into a galaxy full of dangers they were not ready to face. Lisa listened and then asked if the Council had bothered to ask any of those 47 species if they wanted help before imposing 500 years of isolation on them, and Korthek's scales shifted to a new color that suggested he had never considered that question before. The two officers talked for 3 hours while their respective forces waited in tension, and what emerged from that conversation was a possibility that neither the Council nor Earth had considered, which was that maybe both sides had made mistakes and maybe there was a solution that did not require one side to completely surrender to the other. Ben Carter received Lisa's transmission with surprise and skepticism, because the idea of negotiating with an enemy that had brought a fleet to enforce their will seemed naive. But he also recognized that 6 weeks of warfare had proven that neither side could achieve a clean victory without costs that either wanted to pay. Helen Wright advocated for at least hearing what the Council might offer, and she pointed out that humanity's goal was never to destroy the Council, but simply to avoid being controlled by them. So if there was a path to independence that did not require more deaths on both sides, it was worth exploring. The negotiations began on the Defiant because neither side trusted the other enough to meet on their own territory, and the human ship represented neutral ground that both the Council and Earth could accept, though armed guards from both sides lined the corridors leading to the conference room as a reminder that the shooting could resume at any moment, if the talks failed, Admiral. Korthek arrived with Elder Sorthana and Ambassador Velthar, and the 3 Council representatives moved through the Defiant's narrow passages with visible discomfort because their species were used to the spacious vessels that the Council built. Frank Peterson led the human delegation along with Ben Carter, Helen Wright, and Jake Morrison, and they gathered around a table that had been hastily installed in the ship's main cargo bay since the Defiant had no conference room large enough for this meeting. The first hour was tense and formal as both sides stated their positions, with the Council insisting that their probationary period was necessary for humanity's own protection, and Earth countering that no species had the right to imprison another for 500 years regardless of their intentions. Velthar's crystalline form pulsed with colors that the translators interpreted as frustration, and he asked how humanity expected to survive in a galaxy full of species far more advanced than them without Council guidance. Ben Carter leaned back in his chair and said that humans had been surviving against superior forces for their entire history, and just because the Council had fancy ships and energy shields did not mean they understood survival better than a species that had clawed its way up from nothing without anyone's help. The galaxy might be dangerous, he continued, but humans were dangerous too, as the past 6 weeks had proven, and maybe the Council needed to consider that primitive did not mean weak or helpless. Elder Sorthana studied the humans with her ancient eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone listen. You fight like species from before the council, she said, with a ferocity we thought had been bred out of sentient beings through millennia of civilization, and watching you has reminded us of things we had forgotten about survival and desperation and what beings will do when they believe extinction is the alternative to victory, Helen Wright responded, carefully because she understood they were at a critical moment in the discussion. The council created peace by controlling warfare among civilized species, she said, and that is an achievement humanity respects, but you cannot force beings to be civilized by threatening them. You can only create resentment and resistance. What happened over the past 6 weeks was not because humans are barbaric, but because we refuse to accept subjugation even if it comes wrapped in good intentions. The conversation shifted then from arguments to questions, and Cortex asked what humanity wanted if they rejected the Council's probationary period. Jake Morrison answered that Earth wanted what every species wanted, which was the freedom to grow and explore and make their own mistakes, without someone else deciding what was best for them. We are not asking to be left completely alone, he explained. We are willing to learn from the Council and trade with other species and follow reasonable laws, but we will not be children waiting for permission to live our own lives. Ambassador Velthar's color shifted to something the translator called thoughtful, and he asked if humanity understood how unprecedented their request was, that no newly discovered species had ever demanded full Council membership without serving the probationary period first. Frank Peterson said he understood perfectly, and that was exactly why humanity had fought, because sometimes you had to be the first to do something, or everyone would keep following old patterns that no longer made sense. Elder Sorthana called for a recess, and the council representatives withdrew to discuss among themselves while the humans waited in an adjacent room. Lisa Harper brought coffee and sandwiches because negotiations were exhausting work, even without the threat of renewed warfare hanging over everything, and the human team tried to gauge whether the talks were making progress or just delaying the inevitable return to combat. When the council delegation returned 2 hours later, Elder Sorthana carried herself differently, and Helen noticed immediately that something had changed in the alien leader's demeanor. We have discussed your request, Sorthana said, and we have also discussed the implications of this conflict for the council itself, because in fighting you we have learned uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The elder explained that the council had become complacent over 12,000 years of peace, that they had forgotten the galaxy contained threats that did not respect their protocols or accept their authority. Pirates raided the outer colonies. Rogue artificial intelligence collectives operated in the dark spaces between systems, and some species refused council membership entirely and had to be contained through constant vigilance and negotiation. The council had managed these threats through patient diplomacy and occasional shows of force, but it grew more difficult each century as the problems multiplied. You have shown us a different approach, Sorthana continued, one that we had abandoned but perhaps should not have forgotten entirely, and this has led us to a proposal that is unusual, but might serve both our interests. The Council is willing to grant humanity full membership immediately, without a probationary period. But in exchange, Earth must agree to serve as the Council's military arm, dealing with threats that our civilized methods cannot resolve. The humans exchanged glances across the table, and Ben Carter asked for clarification about what serving as the Council's military arm would mean in practice. Cortex explained that humanity would maintain their own command structure and make their own tactical decisions, but they would respond when the Council identified threats that required military intervention. Earth would receive full access to Council technology and knowledge, full voting rights in Council decisions, and payment for military services rendered. Jake Morrison saw the trap in the proposal immediately and pointed it out. You want us to be your warriors, he said, to do the dirty work that civilized species will not do, to be the barbarians you can point at when someone needs to be threatened or destroyed. Velthar's crystalline form flickered with what might have been embarrassment, and he admitted that Morrison's assessment was partially correct. But he argued that it was not exploitation if both sides benefited from the arrangement. Helen Wright asked what would happen if humanity refused to act when the Council wanted military intervention, and Elder Sorthana answered with surprising honesty. Then you would face the same diplomatic and economic pressures that any council member faces when they disagree with the majority, she said. But you would not be expelled or punished beyond what normal politics entails. because the whole point of this proposal is that we need you to remain strong and independent enough to handle threats we cannot. The human delegation requested their own recess, and they argued for 3 hours about whether to accept the Council's offer. Some felt it was a trap that would turn Earth into mercenaries for an alien government, while others pointed out that it gave humanity everything they had fought for, plus access to technology that would advance Earth by centuries. Frank Peterson finally called for a vote, and the decision was unanimous to accept with certain conditions that would protect Earth's sovereignty. The final treaty took 2 more days to negotiate, with lawyers and diplomats from both sides arguing over every detail and implication. The agreement that emerged gave humanity full Council membership, access to all non-restricted technology, voting rights equal to any other member species, and the role of primary military force for Council operations. In exchange, Earth agreed to respond to legitimate threats identified by the Council, to share military innovations with Council defense forces, and to train other species in combat tactics if requested. 8 months after the treaty was signed, the first joint Human Council military base opened on a moon orbiting a gas giant in the frontier territories, and the facility represented something new in galactic history, a place where species that had recently been at war now trained together to face common threats that cared nothing for diplomacy or civilized behavior. Ben Carter walked through the base with a sense of surreal accomplishment, because the corridors were filled with humans working alongside Arxians and Vaneth and a dozen other species, all of them learning to fight together despite having almost nothing in common, except the understanding that the galaxy was bigger and more dangerous than any one species could handle alone. The Earth Defense Fleet had grown rapidly with Council support, and human engineers worked with alien technicians to build vessels that combined Earth's aggressive design philosophy with Council energy systems and faster-than-light drives. The result was a new class of warship that made traditional Council vessels look gentle by comparison. Ships designed not to preserve enemy forces but to destroy threats quickly and completely. Maria Santos commanded one of these new vessels, the EDF Valor, and she stood on her bridge reviewing the mission that would be humanity's first real test as the Council's military arm. A distress call had come from a mining colony in the Outer Reach, a region of space where Council authority was more theoretical than practical, and the reports indicated raiders were attacking civilian facilities with a level of violence that shocked species unused to such brutality. Lisa Harper served as the fleet tactical coordinator, and she had spent weeks planning the response with input from both human strategists and Council advisors who wanted to understand how Earth would handle this kind of situation. The plan she developed was aggressive and direct in ways that made the Council observers nervous, but Elder Sorthana had approved it with the comment that humanity had been chosen for this role precisely because they were willing to do things the Council found uncomfortable. The fleet that jumped into the Outer Reach consisted of 15 human vessels supported by 5 Council ships providing logistics and communications, and Jake Morrison rode aboard the flagship coordinating the operation from the Combat Information Center where dozens of screens tracked every aspect of the mission in real time. The raiders had seized 3 mining stations and were holding the workers hostage while they stripped valuable ore from the facilities, and their ships were brutal-looking things cobbled together from stolen technology and armed with weapons that violated every Council convention on acceptable force. The raider leader had ignored all Council attempts at negotiation, apparently believing that civilized species would never risk civilian lives by attacking while hostages were present. Ben Carter gave the order to begin the operation, and the human fleet split into groups that approached the stations from multiple angles, while the Council ships established a perimeter to prevent escape. The raiders responded exactly as predicted, threatening to kill hostages if the fleet did not withdraw, and they seemed genuinely surprised when the human response was to jam their communications and begin boarding actions simultaneously on all 3 stations. Peter Grant led one of the assault teams, and the tactics they employed were designed to end the situation quickly before the raiders could carry out their threats. Breaching charges blew through station halls in a dozen places at once, and human soldiers flooded into corridors where they engaged raiders in close combat that was brutal and efficient. The raiders were experienced fighters who had terrorized the Outer Reach for years, But they had never faced soldiers who moved with such coordination and fought with such intensity. Nina Foster's team secured the hostages on the second station within 18 minutes of breaching, and she did it by moving so fast that the raiders guarding the civilians never had time to react before they were neutralized. The speed and precision of the operation shocked the Council observers who watched from the support ships because they were used to hostage situations that dragged on for days or weeks of negotiation. The raider ships tried to flee when they realized the stations were lost, but the Council vessels had positioned themselves perfectly to prevent escape, and the human warships pursued with a determination that made retreat impossible. Maria Santos commanded the interception of the largest raider vessel, and the brief battle that followed demonstrated the difference between ships designed by beings who valued preservation and ships designed by beings who understood that sometimes the only solution to a problem was to eliminate it completely. The raider vessel broke apart under concentrated fire from the Valor, and the surviving crew were taken prisoner by Council forces who would process them according to galactic law. The entire operation from initial breach to final capture took less than 3 hours, and the speed of the resolution left the Council advisors struggling to write reports that explained how humans had accomplished in hours what would have taken Council forces weeks or months of careful negotiation. Admiral Cortex reviewed the battle data from his office on the Council homeworld, and he found himself both impressed and troubled by what he saw. The humans had saved hundreds of civilian lives and eliminated a threat that had plagued the outer reach for years, but they had done it with a level of violence that made him uncomfortable, even though he understood it was necessary. His report to the Council noted that humanity was fulfilling their role exactly as intended, but he recommended that Council members prepare themselves for a new approach to security that would challenge their comfortable assumptions about warfare. Helen Wright traveled to the Council homeworld as Earth's first ambassador, and she spent her days in meetings with representatives from species who were still trying to understand what humanity's membership meant for the galactic order they had maintained for 12,000 years. Some welcomed Earth's presence and the security that human military forces provided, while others worried that humanity would corrupt the Council's civilized culture with their aggressive tendencies. Elder Sorthana invited Helen to her private chambers one evening, and the two of them sat looking out at the Council city that sprawled beneath the tower where the Elder lived. "You have changed us already," Sorthana said quietly, "just by being here and showing us what we had, forgotten about survival and strength and the costs of maintaining peace in an imperfect galaxy." Helen asked if the Elder regretted the decision to grant humanity full membership, and Sorthana's ancient face showed something that might have been a smile. "I regret nothing," she said, "because the Council was dying slowly under the weight of our own success, becoming so safe and civilized that we could not deal with the unsafe and uncivilized parts of the galaxy. And you have reminded us that peace must sometimes be defended by those willing to fight for it." 6 months later, Ben Carter stood on the bridge of the EDF Humanity, the flagship of Earth's growing defense fleet, and he watched as 36 ships from a dozen different species assembled for a joint training exercise that would have been impossible a year earlier. The Council had been right about one thing, he reflected, which was that the galaxy was full of dangers that no species could face alone. But they had also learned that humanity brought something valuable to the galactic community beyond just military force. Maria Santos worked at her station nearby, and she looked up with a smile. "The Council called us primitive," she said quietly. Ben nodded, remembering the long journey from that first insulting message to this moment of cooperation. "They did," he agreed, "and we taught them that primitive just means we remember lessons they forgot. Lessons about survival and adaptation, and doing whatever it takes to protect what matters." The fleet jumped together into faster than light, human and alien ships moving as one, carrying with them a new understanding of what the galaxy could be when different species brought their unique strengths to common challenges. The Council had brought order through wisdom and patience, but sometimes order needed defenders who understood chaos, and in humanity they had found beings who could walk the line between civilization and savagery, using both to build something better than either alone could achieve. The galaxy would never be the same, but perhaps that was exactly what it needed. A reminder that progress came not from staying safe within established patterns, but from embracing new possibilities even when they seemed dangerous or uncomfortable. Humanity had called it war when the Council thought they were primitive, but in the end, Both sides learned that the real victory was not defeating each other, but finding a way to make their differences into strengths that served everyone.